much, Craig and everyone, for having me. Thanks for organising it. Thanks for Ozfish for running these events, and also the Murry-Darling Basin Authority for funding it. And also I need to thank the Recreational Fishing Trust who pays my wages. So that's licence money going to good causes. So I'm going to talk about the Murrumbidgee. I've spent probably 80% of my life in the Murrumbidgee. Was born in the catchment, grew up in the catchment. Now live down in Albury, but spent a lot of time here. I'm a conservation manager for New South Wales Fisheries, as Craig said. I won't bore you with what the details of my work are, but I've been working in the Bidgee for a long time and have a pretty good understanding of the system and what's been going on recently. I wasn't going to put some fish photos in, then I saw Matt's talk and I thought I'd better try and trump him and put a few other extras in there. So like Matt, I'm a very keen, passionate angler. I spend most of my spare time when I'm not working on fishing, with my kids particularly these days. So I fished all around the country and all around the world, and yeah, obviously pretty keen on it. So the first question, and I'll get to this at the end, I'm going to introduce you to some different parts of the Murrumbidgee and some different critters that you may or may not be aware of. Some of you guys, particularly the ones who are trout fishermen, may have seen some of these things in the catchment. These things puzzled me for years. They're up in the mountains, all around the streams. Anyway, I'll give a lure to anyone at the end of the talk. We'll reveal what lives and builds these mounds. It's kind of fish related. So the outline of my talk, I'm going to talk briefly about the status of fish in the Murry-Darling Basin, then about, more specifically, the status of fish in the Bidgee, what was here originally, what's here now, why we should care and what you guys can do about it. Some of the stuff Matt's already covered, I'm going to sort of grill down and get a little bit more specifically related to the Murrumbidgee. So as Matt sort of alluded to, things aren't good. Current levels of fish within the Murry-Darling Basin are estimated at 10% of what they were prior to European settlement, so a 90% reduction. As Matt said, there's 46 species in the basin. 26 of those 46 are now either really rare or threatened. Without intervention, it's predicted to fall. There's 11 alien species in the basin, comprising of 80 to 90% of the biomass, largely driven by carp and trout in the upper reaches as well. And there's been a large number of localised extinction of some native fish species. So all of this information and these estimates sort of summarise this map here. This is a basic traffic light system of the condition of fish communities within the basin. Red means very poor, orange is poor, yellow is fair, and light green is good, and dark green is very good. You'll see there's hardly any very good that's up in the Paru, up at the top, but you can see most of the southern basin is either poor or very poor. And that was all before this happened. So this is all these estimates, that mapping, those calculations were all done prior to the last couple of summers, the massive fish kills we've all seen, the drying out of the lower Darling, massive bushfire events, significant fish kills, not just in the Darling, but elsewhere in the systems as well. So highly likely that those numbers have now gotten worse rather than better, unfortunately. And as Matt kind of alluded to, things are pretty crook up his way. Murrumbidgee catchment, unfortunately, despite, like you guys probably listen to Rod's report every weekend, and the Murrumbidgee is probably the best place to come fishing in the southern hemisphere, but the fish community as a whole is not great and has been described as severely degraded. 9 of the 20 native species within the Bidgee are either locally extinct or in really low abundances. Again, that 80 to 90% of the biomass is made up of alien species, largely driven by carp in the lower reaches and trout in the upper reaches. And again, without substantial intervention, this is going to continue to decline and it won't improve. So there's the same map again. I've drilled in to the southern basin. Again, you can see the Murrumbidgee there. And again, mostly red, mostly orange, so mostly poor, very poor of the whole fish community. Unfortunately, things aren't looking great, but how were they in the past? Matt's kind of alluded to this a bit as well. There's just a caption out of William Hovell's diary when he came through the air in 1824. How he described the fish at Yass, that the Murrumbidgee River abounds in excellent fish, same species as the Lachlan, referring to cod there, great flavour, and obviously talks about the size of them as well. Another interesting thing, as Matt said before, we often forget there was pretty significant commercial fisheries in our inland waterways. These are some of the catch data from the Murrumbidgee. There was a commercial fishery in the Murrumbidgee which was closed in 2001. These are just some catch data. You can't really read that, but we'll walk you through it. So the top one is Murray cod, and you can see here up to 10 tonne per year was being taken out of Murray cod. Similar sort of pattern for golden perch, up to 20 tonnes in the peaks there. And the two bottom ones, this is catfish and silver perch, and you can see that those fisheries really declined from the 50s onwards, and then virtually both those species have disappeared from the commercial catch in about the 80s and 90s. So that had a massive impact, but what that's saying is that there was huge abundance of fish in the Murrumbidgee, as Matt alluded to elsewhere in the catchments, and massive, massive populations of fish of a whole range of species as well. So for my first lure for the night, what was here in the past, and I mentioned this in the previous slide, how many fish species were present in the Murrumbidgee catchment? Anyone remember? 20.
46.
No, that's the basin. I'll give you one though. He's listening. There it is, 20 species. There they are. That was what was present in the Murrumbidgee. Okay, for the next lure, what's left? How many of the 20 are still remaining? 9. Nah, that's close. 9 are kind of in trouble. 10%. 10%? Oh, my maths is not good enough. You've got to give me a number. Come on, it's less than 20. Go up a little. 15. There he is. Boom. 15. 15. We've got basically 5 species missing from the Bidgee that we think are now no longer present. I'll go into those in a minute. What have they been replaced by? Obviously introduced species. We've got 7 species of introduced fish in the Murrumbidgee. Obviously public enemy number 1 up the top there, and has major issues, but obviously all the other species do as well. We've got gambusia, redfin, oriental weatherloach, goldfish, and obviously our 2 trout species. We probably could throw brook trout in there. There's one spot in the Bidgee where they may still be, but anyway, we won't talk about that. So what's missing? What are the 5 species that are missing and now considered locally extinct in the Murrumbidgee? Some of you may be familiar with these, some of you may not. I'm going to run you through them quickly. Southern pygmy perch. These are little guys pretty dear to my heart. It's a small native wetland species, grows to about 7 or 8 centimetres long. These guys used to be highly abundant in the Bidgee catchment. Up until about the mid-70s, they were catching these things everywhere. They even caught catching them up in the Tumut River in the wetlands there, even out in the irrigation systems around Naranda and Leeton. They're gone from the Bidgee now. We've got 3 populations of these guys left in New South Wales, almost gone. Murray hardyhead, these guys, lots of records in the Bidgee again, blipped out a bit earlier than the pygmy perch. Now these guys aren't in New South Wales anymore. There's been a reintroduction back down in the lower reaches of the Murray, but these guys are basically locally extinct from the entire state now. Olive perch, similar to the southern pygmy perch. These are another small wetland species. Lots of records in the Bidgee. Again, no records in the Bidgee past the 60s of these guys. Haven't been seen for over 50 years in the Murrumbidgee. Flathead galaxius, again, these guys were present in the Bidgee up until the mid to late 70s. Lots of records not far from here, down around Naranda, places like that. These guys haven't been seen in New South Wales since 2010 now, so most likely locally extinct in New South Wales as well. Finally, these little guys here, again, another small native fish, mostly wetland, predominantly wetland species, purple spotted gudgeon, lots of records from the Bidgee. Again, these guys haven't been seen for over 50 years in the Murrumbidgee. So what do all these fish have in common? Before I get on to that. So these species, as Matt said, cannot return on their own. If we want these back in the river or in our wetlands, in our systems, then we need to put them back. We need to facilitate them returning. They cannot do it on their own due to obviously all the barriers we've got in the systems. So where do they live? This is the cruncher. So what do all those 5 species have in common? This is where they live. These are predominantly wetland species. These are the habitats they live in. Lots of aquatic vegetation, slow or still flowing water, predominantly wetlands or off-channel systems like you see there. So why do we care? Who cares? They're a few little fish, Granted, some of them got pretty colours on them. They don't occur anywhere else in the world. They're only here, they're our fish, they're unique, but we don't really care. No one really cares about a few little fish besides a few little fish nerds. Well, I'm going to tell you why you should care. And I'm going to do it with the help of the story by H.K. Anderson. This guy was the Inland Fisheries Officer out at Naranda from 1912 through to 1920. That's him there with the pipe sifting through a net of fish down on the Bidgee, not too far from Naranda. And I'm going to tell you why. He's going to help me tell you why we should care. And it was a project that he worked on called Utilising Nature's Waste back in that period between 1912 and 1920. And so what they did and what he saw, and we're very lucky that he, unlike most people around in the day, he actually recorded all this and wrote it down. And so what he saw in all of the wetlands, creeks, anabranches and stuff that flooded every year in those times down there, then would dry back out, and some of those wetlands and those lagoons and billabongs would dry out, and the fish that were in them would perish. And he saw this as a waste. It was nature's waste. And anyway, he wanted to capitalise on and utilise this. This is way before we could breed native fish, way before we had stocking programs. And he wanted to capture those fish and utilise them to stock other areas where There weren't native fish, particularly on the east coast. They took heaps of these things over and stocked dams around Sydney, and they took a lot to the newly built Burrinjuck Dam as well. So how he described those waterholes, those wetlands, those lagoons, he said all of the waterholes teemed with fish life that can hardly be realised. They were chock-a-block full of things. And I'm not just talking about the little pygmy perch and the other ones that we don't care. They collected thousands and thousands of Murray cod and golden perch, up to 3 inches long, so all juveniles, all small fish from all of these wetlands. Little puddles like that, they were getting thousands and thousands of juvenile Murray cod and golden perch out of. And they also caught macquarie perch, blackfish, catfish, silver perch, gudgeons, pygmy perch, all the things I just mentioned that are gone from the system. And hundreds of thousands of these things were translocated all over the state. Prospect Dam up near Sydney, Cataract Dam up near Sydney, Burrinjuck Dam, as I said before, were all translocated from these areas to all other places and back into the Murrumbidgee itself. So these wetlands were the nursery grounds of our native fish. They were the engine room for native fish populations back then. The fish would flow in with the water when they were connected, the eggs would come in, the larvae would come in. Those wetlands were highly productive. They're much warmer, much more food, much more fertile, and these little fish would go in and they would grow like stink, and then when they would reconnect, they would obviously repopulate the river again. Those systems and that function of those systems is now largely lost. This is what's happened to our wetlands. This is what they look like now. There's the photo before. That's McKenna's Lagoon. That's not far downstream from the Narrandera. And there's some photos of it over the last 20 years. So it wasn't looking too bad at the start of the 2000s. It was getting a bit of water back then and has seriously degraded since. It's had water in it only a handful of times. It's had environmental water put into it a few times as well. But essentially the function that wetland and all the others provided in the system is now gone from a fish nursery perspective. And what's happened? This is what's happened to the flow. This is the level of the gauge at Darlington Point, down near where McKenna's Lagoon is, at about 4 metres. So once it gets above about 4 metres at Darlington Point, it goes out of the channel, starts filling into these wetlands and these creeks and runners outside the river. And you can see there, obviously it's a bit up and down. 50s were a pretty wet decade, but you can see from the 1990s onwards, it hardly ever gets above that level to connect those wetlands. And people kind of go, oh yeah, that's just natural variability, that's cycles, you know, we have wet and dry decades. That's true, I agree. But here's a graph. This is actually the flows at Yarrawonga. We haven't done them for the Bidgee yet, but it's a similar pattern. And so yeah, we get wet and dry decades. So these are the flows at Yarrawonga, and there's different flow levels. So the orange one at the top there, that's flows of above 40,000 megalitres a day at Yarrawonga. So that's what you need to get into the floodplain and the runners at Yarrawonga. And the next one down is above, the blue one is 60,000, and the next one is 80,000, the grey one and the yellow one is 100,000. And you can see for all of those high level flow events, okay, yeah, we've got wet decades and we've got dry decades, it goes up and down, but you can see the general trend for all of those high flows that's getting water into those wetlands is seriously declining, and it doesn't even count the last 10 years, and I would hate to see what it looks like now. So it's not just about those nursery habitats, it's also about productivity in our systems. So cod, big cod, all of the fish within our river systems predominantly are made up of carbon, largely from carbon from the floodplain. There's some really interesting research recently done that shows that these systems, our river systems, are being driven by carbon and nutrients from the floodplain. This is kind of contrary to a lot of the research overseas. It shows that a lot of the productivity and a lot of the ecosystems are driven by productivity within stream. Our systems are largely driven by floodplain carbon and nutrients coming into the system. Floodplain carbon feeds our rivers. Our in-stream food webs are fueled by terrestrial carbon. So that's carbon and nutrients coming in off the floodplain. Some recent work by Nick Bond and co have modelled that historical flow regimes were producing about 3.5 to 4 times the amount of basal resources, so carbon and nutrients going into the system than our current flow regimes are. So that's a 3.5 to 4 times reduction in productivity. So low flows equals low nutrient and low metabolic and low productivity. So just to give you some numbers, this is some work done by Daryl Nielsen. The 2010-11 floods in Barmah-Millawa, per day there was 280 tonnes of carbon coming into the river and 15 tonnes of nutrients coming into the river. So they're pretty big numbers, and that's a lot of productivity. So if we want more fish in our rivers, we need more water on our floodplains. What happens when we get it wrong? What happens when we don't have enough water on our floodplains regularly enough to get those nutrients coming in slowly and trickling every now and again? We get an influx of nutrients, we get an influx of carbon. What happens when it doesn't happen regularly enough? Well, this is what happens. You guys have seen it happen. It's happened several times in recent years in the bottom of the Bidgee. We've had some really significant blackwater events, some major fish kills. It's happened in the Murray. It's going to continue to happen unless we can find a way to get more water on the floodplains and flush that carbon into the river more regularly. So what are we doing to fix this? There's been, as Matt said, there's been a whole bunch of environmental water activities occur. Here's a list. I don't expect you to read it all. This is just purely for, I guess, to show you an example of how much has been happening in the Murrumbidgee for fish with environmental water. And it's not just about filling in the peaks and troughs like Matt said. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that's been done in the Bidgee. I'm going to run you through a couple of specific examples, but we've run some major flows to try and dilute and to slow down that hypoxic black water coming in off the floodplains and to provide fresh water behind it. We've done wetland reconnection flows where we're reconnecting the wetlands to try and get fish into them and then get them back out again. We've done long duration flows for trout cod and Murray cod spawning events. We've done golden perch spawning events like Matt said, and I'm going to talk about one of those. And we've done reconnection flows as well. So there's a lot been happening since about 2010 in the Murrumbidgee around environmental water for fish. So here's one example. This was the Murrumbidgee cod flow in 2012. This is one of the first cod flows that occurred, certainly the first in the Bidgee. And so I'm going to run you briefly through what happened here. I hate hydrographs, particularly for people who haven't seen them. This is a hydrograph. This is basically the flow at the Darlington Point gauge. We're back on the Darlington Point gauge again. This is the cod spawning window. Basically, what happens in the Murrumbidgee and every other regulated river, around spawning time, it coincides with the same time that there's a peak demand in irrigation, right? So this bottom line here, this is the river height at Darlington Point. The dark blue line is the river height at Darlington Point in 2011. This is about when cod start nesting, right? So for those of you who don't know how cod breed, cod lay adhesive eggs. They stick them on hard surfaces like snags, rocks, muddy, hard clay banks. And then they stay and guard those eggs for the next sort of 5 to 14 days. Then the eggs hatch and the larvae drift downstream. So what happens is they swim around, they find a nest site, and then they stay there. If you disturb that nest or you remove the water from around that nest, obviously it's a failed spawning attempt. So what happens is, obviously every year, right about when the cod are looking for their nest or they've found their nests and doing their thing, irrigation demand ramps up, they open the gates and it all goes out of the river down the irrigation channels. And we see a massive drop in the river. So you can see here, this is about 2.5 metres, a bit over, at Darlington Point. In the space of a week, dropped by about 1.5 metres, and then down about another metre within the next week. So you nearly lost 2 metres of height off the river channel. So any of the cod that were nesting in those top 2 metres, their nests are gone. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to fill that hole in the river and obviously keep those nests submerged and have a successful nesting and spawning event for Murray cod in that section of the river. So this pink line was what we kind of proposed. We said, righto, this is our hypothetical hydrograph. We want to basically see the river bouncing along as it was and come up and then keep it stable around that 60% bank full. And then right at the end of the spawning window, we want to put a bit of a flush down to try and help disperse those larvae once they hatch out and start drifting down. So this green line is 60% bank full, and this blue line, dotted blue line at the top is bank full. So we get over that, we're going out on the floodplain. And here it is. This was the next year. So this was 2012. This light blue line, this was our hydrograph for 2012. So this was the actual year that we put the environmental water in. And so obviously it's pretty hard for the river regulators. This is not the kind of stuff they do. You know, they get an order, give us 10 megs downstream, and they turn the tap on and let 10 megs out. We're trying to get them to mix things around a bit and fill holes. So this was really difficult for them, and they did a pretty good job. So the river was bouncing along as it was. And then you can see here, about the same time as it did the year before, started to drop off. So then we said, righto, put our water in here, and we tried to fill it. And they did a bit of a peak, and but it bumped along kind of almost where we wanted it. And then we got the spike at the end to obviously aid with dispersion out of those nests. And you can see we basically filled that hole in the river and maintained obviously most of that habitat submerged where the cod were nesting. And this was the result. Murray cod eggs, Murray cod larvae, blackfish larvae, a whole bunch of fish larvae that occurred on the back of that event. Here's another one. This was one that was only done last summer, so 2018, 2019 summer. This is on the low Bidgee. And so as I mentioned before, the theory about, the floodplain or those wetland productivity, and some of you may have heard about, golden perch spawning success and recruitment out of Menindee lakes, obviously before it dried out, and there's lots of fish that have been picked up all around the systems that have been spawned and grown successfully out of Menindee lakes, because they come in, they drift in there as eggs and larvae. It's a really productive system. They grow like stink and then they disperse out into the system. So all of our wetlands would have been operating like that historically. So we were trying to replicate that down in the low Bidgee. This is the Murrumbidgee down here, Balranald here. I'm not sure how familiar all you guys are with this. This is all low Bidgee floodplain. There's two big lake systems in it. There's Taylor Lake and Yanga Lake. We wanted to turn the regulator on up here, flow the water all the way down into both these lakes, out of the river. At the same time, we thought that golden perch would be spawning in the river. And then we would hope that the eggs and the larvae would drift down into these lakes where there's lots of tucker, it's nice and warm, they would grow like stink. And then at some point, we'd try and get them back into the river by another reconnection flow. Anyway, what we found was really interesting, or what the Charles Sturt Uni guys that were doing the research found was really interesting. Didn't play out at all the way we had thought it would. We got no golden perch larvae at all in the river. Nothing at all came out of the river. We got Murray cod larvae came out of the river, and there was Murray cod eggs came out of the river. But what we did find, which is the first time it's been recorded that I know of, was we actually got golden perch spawning down here in this Taylor Creek that the water was flowing through. So there's a resident population, a small population of golden perch here. They all spawned on the flows, and the eggs and larvae went into the lakes, and lo and behold, we got juvenile golden perch. So we had a spawning event. Wasn't how we thought it would play out, but yeah, it certainly, basically was the same principle, except we just didn't think those fish were in those creeks, and we didn't think they would spawn on the floodplain like they did. Historically, we always think that the golden perch particularly spawn in the rivers, not so much on the floodplain or in those floodplain creeks. So that's kind of something we've learnt fairly recently, and it was a pretty successful event. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get any of those fish back out again yet. We haven't had enough water, but that's the next piece of the puzzle. We've put some flows down there to maintain those refuge habitats where they're persisting in, and hopefully when we get some more rain, we'll be able to put some reconnection flows, and some of those fish will get the opportunity to move back out of the system. So I'm just going to touch on cold water pollution now. That's the environmental water stuff. Matt mentioned it before. I'm going to give you a bit of an example, because we're here in Wagga, about the cold water pollution here at Wagga. Obviously, we've got Burrinjuck and Tumut, Burrinjuck and Blowering Dam coming down the Tumut. For those of you who aren't familiar with what cold water is, there's basically the schematic. We get stratified water in the dam water gets released from the bottom and it's cold, and we get cold fish, and they don't like that. Why don't they like that? Firstly, it affects productivity and it affects their survival and growth rate. Can't really pick that up, but anyway, basically this is survival at 31 days of Murray cod. This is at 18 to 24 degrees, and this is at 12 to 14 degrees. So you get much greater survival and growth when the water's warmer, as it would have been naturally. This is a culture for me. This is a really interesting graph, and I'm going to walk you through it. So this is a graph of the spawning windows and the temperature of the Murrumbidgee at Wagga compared to Jugion Creek, which is being used as a simulated natural. So this solid line here is the water temperature at Wagga. This is the June through to June, that's a 12-month period. And this dotted line is the water temperature in Jugion Creek, which is what the Bidgee would have been naturally, or that's the proxy for that. And these little boxes are spawning windows. So you can see here, this is Murray cod, the green one. They spawn from start of September through to early December, and they need water about 18 degrees. So you can see here, for their whole spawning window, it just got warm enough at the end for them to get to spawn in the Bidgee at Wagga. These other species, so the blue one is silver perch, the dark blue one's catfish, and the pink one is golden perch. The river, they need there's their spawning window, October through to end of Feb. They need water about 22 degrees, thereabouts. You can see the river, for those three species, never gets warm enough at Wagga to allow them to spawn. I reckon that's pretty stark. Snags, I'm going to talk about snags a little bit as well, because I love snags almost as much as Matt. So why I want to talk about snags is they're not just structure. So snags are exchange sites. And what I mean by exchange sites, they're sites to allow productivity to occur as well. So you can see here's a cod sitting in a snag that's actually down near hay. All this slimy, gunky stuff that's on the snags that gives you the shits when your lure drags over it and stops working properly. That's good stuff. That's biofilm. So that's a combination of bacteria and algae. That's primary productivity in our river systems. So other than the carbon and the stuff coming in off the floodplain, this is the other big driver of these ecosystems. And I'm going to give you a number about how much of that we've lost in our system. So we don't have these numbers for the Murrumbidgee, but they've worked out what the surface area of the snags being removed from the Murray is. So this is work done by Darren Baldwin. Over 1,500 snags per river kilometre were pulled out of the Murray. This is downstream of Wagga, and he's worked out what that equates to in surface area. So per river kilometre, it is 119,000 square metres, so, which is almost 20 hectares of surface area per river kilometre. Think about that number for a while. 20 hectares per river kilometre of surface area of productivity that's been lost from those systems. That's massive. 20 hectares, that's a huge area per kilometre. So that blows my mind. And that's productivity. So when you think about snags, don't just think about them as structure, as places for fish to hang out. They are the reefs of our rivers. These things provide the primary productivity and the sites for that to occur, and they drive that productivity. And that's, I think a lot of that's got to do with the fact that we saw that 3 times increase in populations where they re-snagged that section of the Murray. It's not just about physical habitat, it's about the productivity of the system as well. So the future, I wouldn't be standing here today if I didn't think our native fish populations were recoverable. They're 100% recoverable. We know what we need to do to recover native fish populations. Matt spoke about it. We've got a whole bunch of really intelligent scientists working within the department that have told us what we need to do. There's a whole bunch of information and literature out there that we know what we need to do, and we know how to restore fish populations. But we need you guys to help us do it. We need the community behind us, and we need people to be screaming out for this stuff to happen. And I want to challenge you guys to think about, what do you want to see? What do you want to see for the future of your rivers? What do you want to see? How do you want to see those rivers in the future? So what can you do? Matt's already covered all this stuff. I'm really going to focus on the first one there. Increase your knowledge and understanding of the system and what's happening and what's being done. There's a lot of misinformation out there these days, particularly on social media. There's a lot of misinformation out there. All of the stuff I've been talking about, it's all, I can provide you with a whole bunch of information and literature and documents that support this. If you want more information, go out there and seek it. Talk to me, talk to Matt, talk to Craig, and get yourself better informed about what's been happening and what's being done and what you can do. Get on board with environmental water, support it, identify watering targets, and get some better representative in water management. There is a very little voice in water management from a recreational fishing perspective at the moment. This is one of the big ticket items for you guys, and the big ticket items affecting native fish is water and water management. And we often don't have a seat, or you guys often don't have a seat at that table and aren't screaming loud enough, I don't think. Speak up and advocate for better outcomes for fish. As Matt said so eloquently, restore habitat. More habitat equals more fish. That's about got me done. Righto. Boom! Wow! I've put that slide up, I reckon, at about 15 presentations. No one's ever got it before. Did you tell him, Matt? These are a weird little critter. Mate, these things blow my mind. They're not cooked, by the way. That's how they are. They're orange like that in real life. These things they live on the land. They burrow into those little burrows down into the wetlands. They're all up around the hills in Tumut and Tumbarumba. They go all the way down into Tasmania. There's a whole bunch of different species. This is the one we get here. They're a cool little critter. And they are cranky as a hornet. These things, you put 2 of them in a tank together, they will just destroy each other. That's why they live in solitary burrows. I don't know how they find each other, how they mate. No one knows anything about them besides the fact they live in the bush up there. Anyway, cool critter. Are they native? Yeah, they're native. Yeah. I think there's 6 different species. We only get 1 species up here. The rest are all south here. There's a whole bunch down in Victoria and down in Tassie as well. And I'm going to leave you with a quote. So this is a quote from a guy by the name of Neil Dennison, who was a commercial fisher down on the Bidgee below Narrandera. He recently died in a nursing home in Tumut about 6 years ago, I think. Anyway, I'm not going to read it. I want you to read that and reflect on that. Thanks, guys.